Good morning still, Committee on Ways and Means. It is 10-ish. We are going to take some testimony on a recommendation regarding pilot funds that was in the governor's recommended budget. We're going in a funny order with testimony because of people's schedules. And so we're going to hear from Samantha Sheehan from Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and then Ted Barnett from Joint Fiscal to give us the big picture view of things. And then we're gonna talk to Kirby. So Samantha, would you like to join us, please? Thank you. Appreciate it. All right.
Good morning.
Thank you
Thank you for having me back. And I am happy to talk with you about this issue, which is a top priority for VLCT members generally.
The slides should have been, I think the slides were posted. Perhaps refresh.
Did you, when I opened my email, it looked like the email sent this morning.
It did send.
Okay.
They sent an email that she posted. I remember all that happening, actually. But
I have 10.
to share the application, which is the actual slides or your full screen. Oh. Good.
okay. Let's take a brief moment.
Sure.
I am remembering an email from Ted and not an email from you. So I don't think it did send.
Okay.
Ted's slides are up.
Um,
So if you could send them after, that would be great.
okay. Or I can forward the email to Lindsay right now. That. Oh, it still didn't send. Okay. Let me just. I seem to be having an Outlook issue. Let's try one more.
It's okay, we can wait until after.
That's right.
Great. All the computers start going wrong around this time of year because they want us all to take a rest.
Both of Dal and I have a case of the Fridays, but we'll go through it. Okay. So. I'll begin by saying that efforts to lower municipal property taxes and to support flood resiliency and the recovery of flood impacted communities are both top priorities of VLCT membership, or all 247 municipalities statewide. VLCT strongly supports H-164, which is on your wall here, which would modernize the LOT formula and return the growing pilot surplus fund to the municipalities who raise the revenues. I trust that you know a lot about local option tax, but I've prepared some maybe fun facts that maybe you didn't know. So there are 34 municipalities to date who have acted to adopt an LOT, and we know of at least 8 who are calling the question at this town meeting on Tuesday. With the proliferation of short-term rentals and online commerce, the opportunity of benefiting from local option tax revenue has really opened up for a lot of communities that were not considering that path in the past or were not able to because they were not chartered. As of right now, until Tuesday, all of the 34 communities that have an LOT established have done so through a charter change process. And almost all of them have obligated LOT revenues in their charter. So many of these programs include buying down local property tax or contribution to the municipal general fund, economic development programming to support more local commerce in the local economy, some downtown activation efforts, recreational facilities, and debt service is a very common one. It appears that many municipalities passed a bond question and an LOT at the same time. There's a long history of actions by prior legislative bodies to modify and expand the LOT program over the years. which started with Act 60 in 1997. It was a 60-40 withholding split then. For many years, there was a sunset, but every few years would be extended. And at times, eligibility criteria were changed for the participating municipalities. And then, of course, last year, we are very appreciative that the legislature took action to allow non-chartered municipalities to adopt LOT. So all of that is to say that it is a strongly held opinion or truth of the municipalities who have a local option tax of one or another, that these are local revenues that are created by local process. So that's to say they are not state revenues, they are local revenues. The surplus, the current surplus in the pilot special fund, according to JFO, has been contributed to by two primary factors. One is the growing number of communities adopting a local option tax. The other is a quickly growing consumption tax receipts overall, which are up about 44% from around 2019. The current surplus is 10.3 million, with the municipalities that were brought on in 24, which are two new ones. So last year, the surplus was about 3.3. The year before that, it was about 3 million. JFO projects that just the addition of the two new municipalities will add about 660,000. So it's likely that an additional surplus for FY25 could be around 4 million.
And folks, the Joint Fiscal Office is gonna come in and talk through their analysis of all of these funds.
So we have, Josh and I, the advocacy team at VLCT, have consulted with all 34 towns who have an LOT right now. Our last meeting with them had about 60 people at it. So we had legislative representation, staff, clerks, treasurers. And they all unanimously prefer that the surplus be returned to the towns that generated it through local option tax.
Sure.
They also all object to proposals that may appropriate the surplus to a program that they would not be eligible for. So an easy example I've been using to articulate this is 3-acre funding. There are 3-acre grants through the Clean Water Act, but only about half of the municipalities with LOT have a 3-acre site. So that would leave half that have contributed to the surplus that would not be able to reach that money.
Can I use another example?
Sure.
So a community that did not have any flood impacts for the last 2 years, who has an LOT?
I have a slide. Yeah. So there are some municipalities that fall into that position. But of course, we have municipalities with LOT, municipalities which are pilot eligible, who are owed a payment in lieu of taxes. And then we have municipalities that have experienced a flood in 2024. In several cases, a municipality has all three of those things right now. In some cases, they're one or the other. So there are, so it is a priority of VLCT. This is on our member approved and member developed policy list for you all to continue supporting funding for the ongoing buyout program for flood endangered homes. We would also like that support to be available for the relocation and rebuilding of municipal buildings, which are important for ensuring shelter and emergency operations during and in the wake of a flood. And we do have many municipalities whose only properties are imperiled by the floodplain. There are 51 municipalities that have at least one buyout property that participated in the VEM program already. 9 of the 34 LOT towns have gone through a buyout. And many of those that have gone through a buyout are also pilot eligible. And as you'll hear from JFO, have for many years not received a full proration of their pilot fee. And so Johnson is not all three. They don't have an LOT, but Barry, Montpelier, Berlin, and Waterbury are all three. I believe Manchester is another one. So these are some large communities that experienced significant impacts in 2024, who have been shorted on their pilot fee, have had damage to their grand list from the buyouts, and have had their local revenue in the form of LOT sitting in state coffers. So we generally support returning funds to those communities through this proposal. We have spoken with the Department of Taxes and feel confident that this $1 million appropriation as proposed would cover the bill, so that municipalities who have lost grand list revenue through the buyout program will be made whole for up to 5 years, which will give them time to hopefully, with other legislative support for other actions, will hopefully be able to, see redevelopment and the relocation of residential property and to have some growth on their grand list over that period of time. That would be the goal.
Is tax, in your conversations with tax, did you discuss sending them? So perfect, thanks for changing the slide. You discussed moving, what it would look like to return money to municipalities from whence it came?
Yeah, we did. We understand that this could be complex, but I think when you speak with JFO, so our observation is that there is a point in time at which the surplus began. And it looks like it was a quarter of the year, like there was a quarter in fiscal year 23 where the surplus began to accrue. So what we would like to see happen and feel is achievable is that the municipalities which had a LOT between that period where the surplus actually started and a point in time to be determined by legislative action, whether that's the end of this fiscal year or even a quarter or two ago in the past, that the surplus developed in that discrete period would be equitably dispersed. Although I did sort of glaze over one of my points, which is that there should always be a surplus. We want the pilot fee eligible towns to receive a full prorated pilot fee. And there are good reasons to also talk about in the future, not right now, revisions to potentially the pilot program to make sure that that is still fair and working well. And so now that we are in this healthy place with consumption revenues and more municipalities are leveraging this tool to support their local budgets, this is a really good time to open up that conversation, but there should always be more than 100% of what the state has obligated in that surplus fund. We do not advocate for raiding the fund. But just taking, it's like a tax return is how these municipal officials feel about it. Like they've overpaid their LOT tax and they would like a return from what they've overpaid. And they'll put it to good use.
Thanks, and we'll talk to tax. That's
Yeah, awesome.
really. I just know from sort of extensive in the weeds administrative testimony, LOT is an administrative nightmare for them.
Mhm,
And that is really a lot of this committee's historic resistance to it,
mhm.
was trying to, and so want to really, I imagine that unrolling an administrative nightmare is probably also an administrative nightmare. And so I want to talk to them about it.
Yeah, we are reasonable people in municipal government, so we would like a simple, fair method of return. It doesn't need to be down to a half penny, and that would be well appreciated in a really difficult budget year.
Great. Yes, Representative Feltus and then Odie and then Higley.
So this proposal would return money to communities that had a buyout property, provided they were a local option tax.
No,
Not just other.
the governor's proposal would return or provide funds towards the grand list for all 51 municipalities that have had a buyout.
Irrespective of whether they had a local option tax or
Mhm.
not.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. That's good for me.
Me too.
But, you know,
Yeah,
No,
but you
yeah.
gotta find, you've gotta.
if VLCT's position on this is counterintuitive, I'll add that it's sort of unique to the organization, unique to the position of local leaders over many years. Our members, believe that the floodplain management and, flood hazard mitigation should be managed by the state. I live about a mile under the floodwaters, the headwaters. I live well within the floodwaters, about a mile below the headwaters of the White River. You know, it goes right through my backyard and into Rochester, right? And it goes through Rochester and into Stockbridge. So, these decisions to go through the buyout process are painful and difficult, but they are the right decisions. And there's a broad public benefit to this state program and process be managed at the state level. So it's we don't want the majority of the surplus funds to go out to non-LOT generating communities. However, we, definitely concede that this is something we're sort of all in together when it comes to floodplain management as well. So it seems like a fair ask to us.
Representative Odie and then
No,
Representative
I'm gonna
Quigley.
pass.
Okay, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just learning a little bit about the local options tax. Again, a certain percentage of it goes to the state, correct?
Currently 30% plus a fee.
30%. So that surplus that you're talking about, maybe we'll be talking about this, but is there another option to maybe create a credit so that the money wouldn't have to come back? Credit on what you might pay in the next year?
Oh, maybe like prorate the withholding for the following fiscal year. I think that's something we could talk about. Yeah. If that would be easier to facilitate for,
Yeah.
It may be harder, I don't know.
Maybe it
Yeah.
would.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the fun.
I think not. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy.
Thank
your
you
next
for,
meeting.
being flexible with the time. Thank you to JFO for being flexible.
Thank you for going
Okay.
to support the budget conference committee.
Happy Friday.
Stand strong down there, please.
I will.
Okay, thank you. If you'd like to join us.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. I'm gonna spend more time talking about the Pilots Fund more broadly, and how the trajectory of revenues going into the fund, how we ended up where we currently are, and talk a bit about some of the different options that were mentioned by VLCT just now. So yeah, some of this will certainly be a review, absolutely. And so I will make this full screen. Yes, starting with pilot. What is the pilot program? It starts for payment in lieu of taxes. It's designed to compensate municipality for the value of state-owned property that is otherwise exempt. When we're talking about like the pilot special fund, we're referring to the general pilot program, which compensates municipalities for the value of state-owned buildings. There's a separate A&R pilot program, which compensates municipalities for the value of land that's purchased for conservation. I'm not going to talk about this in this segment. And the general pilot program was created by Act 60 of 1997. It existed previous to that, but then was let lapse. And so the current structure of it came about in Act 60. So the pilot special fund receives 30% of local option tax revenue minus a $5.98 return fee that goes to the Department of Taxes for processing and administering and figuring out all the fun local option tax complexities. Local option taxes are in statute a 1% additional tax that can be placed on sales, not use, just sales. rooms, or meals and alcohol, or a number of combination of those. In 2024, data from the Department of Taxes indicated that 28 municipalities had a local option tax on meals and rooms. And my number is hidden here. I think 22 had a local option tax on sales. These are duplicative, so in the number of 28, it's counting the folks who had a local option tax on meals and rooms and sales. These aren't mutually exclusive. And then also, as mentioned, Act 144 was a substantial change to the ability to implement a lot. Folks could do it without a charter change.
I just want to, sorry, just jump in here for a
Yeah.
second, to really clarify this point, that it's not just towns without a charter can now have a local option tax. It's that any town can have a local option tax without having to change their charter. So it makes it significantly easier for any community to do it.
Exactly. And that previously that ability was limited to the gold towns, the folks who met certain property tax criteria that were outlined in Act 60 and later amended. The Commissioner of Taxes can, in Act 144, there's mention that there was 8 that were on the town meeting day docket potentially. The Commissioner of Taxes, for administrative ease, can limit the number of new local option taxes to 5. And yes, there is a considerable, one of my favorite pieces of testimony is the Department of Taxes showing maps of different, it's really fantastic, of how the complexity of, depending on, you might have a mailing address that's different than your town address, and figuring out what the additional 1% and how that applies. Really appreciate all the hard work that they do to make taxpayers aware of those complexities. So within the general or building pilot program, there are different payments. There is the general pilot payments. So this is kind of everything except for correctional facilities. This is in section B142 of the budget. It includes UVM buildings, and UVM buildings are subject to a $750,000 statutory cap. So the limit of the kind of pilot value of UVM properties is limited to $750,000. There is a correctional facility pilot payment. And so there are 2 separate payments. There's a $40,000 payment for correctional facilities that aren't Newport and Springfield. They have a slightly different structure of pilot payment for their correctional facilities. They came along later. And the general pilot appropriation, so not including the additional correctional facility payment or the payment to Montpelier, which is not a part of fiscal year 26, was 11.25 million in fiscal year 24. And this was the first time that the pilot program had been fully funded. There was no proration of payments. So the calculation of pilot payments is outlined in statute in 32 VSA 3703, and it really relies on 3 core variables. You're looking at total assessed value, the common level or CLA is included here too, and the municipal tax rate. And so the total assessed value, the key piece here is that it is based on the insurance replacement value of buildings. It is not the fair market value. So how this is determined, the agency of administration, the contractor that provides the insurance replacement values of these properties to PBR. And this only includes the value of buildings. For correctional facilities, the definition in statute also includes the value of underlying land. So there's a little wrinkle there. So you're taking this total assessed value, and you're multiplying by the common level of appraisal, which like this broke my brain the first time I read it, because in the education property tax context, right, the values are divided by the CLA to bring them up to statewide value, but you're doing the opposite calculation here. You're taking statewide values that are, calculated through insurance replacement value, and you're bringing those values down to the municipal grand list level. So that's kind of the intuition behind multiplying by the CLA as opposed to dividing. And so, and then you multiply by 1%, and then you develop this adjusted municipal tax rate, which is the total sum of money that the municipality has voted for all of their non-educational expenses divided by the municipal grand list. So you have this assessed value multiplied by the CLA, multiplied by the adjusted tax rate, and you have your pilot payment. So just a little bit of context on how PBR gets to those specific numbers from towns. I will also flag that if there's a case that in certain municipalities, because of a decrease in their CLA, they're actually receiving a slightly lower pilot payment if the value of buildings haven't changed. So, and I fielded some questions from folks that why is my pilot payment gone down this year? It's because the CLA is dropping.
The insurance value, is that adjusted yearly?
That is adjusted yearly. And yes, it's depending on what the contractor sends along. Yes.
Good.
Yes.
So Ted, thank you. I was speaking with a representative who represents the town of Johnson.
Mhm.
They're one of the towns that had a decreasing amount coming from the pilot program. And looking at it, the values had stayed the same on the insurance replacement value in the buildings. But the grand list had gone up.
Mhm.
So as a percentage of the grand list, the state-owned buildings comprised a smaller share, so that's what determined that their value, the calculation actually went down. So it's interesting to look at that to say that the actual payment by the state went down. It's a little odd in that situation. Is there a way to address that within the formula?
There's certainly ways to address it in the formula. I would say kind of in a time when there was less property value appreciation, the CLA adjustment was less of a factor. And this is kind of a feature of the way property values are changing in the state currently. You can certainly, obviously this would be policy choices, but think through the role of the CLA in the current structure and whether that adjustment needs to be made. I think that would be the main consideration in that piece. And it's a policy consideration on that part. So providing a map of where pilot payments are, how they're distributed across the state. Broadly speaking, unsurprisingly, Montpelier, Burlington, and municipalities that are hosting Vermont State University locations are large receivers they really receive a larger sum of pilot payments. Outside of those broad categories, many pilot payments are quite small. So 118 payments. When I refer to payments, there are certain, so for example, in Randolph, there's a payment that's made to the town of Randolph, and there's a payment that's made to Randolph's fire district. So 118 doesn't necessarily mean specific towns. It refers to payments to different municipal jurisdictions. But 118 pilot payments in fiscal year 24 were less than $25,000. So now getting into the revenue and appropriation trajectories that were mentioned earlier, really start to see in this chart here that between fiscal year 17 and fiscal year 21, revenue and expenses were fairly closely matched. A few years, revenues were higher than expenses, and there was in the proration process and figuring out how much revenue was available, expenses were geared to try and match that in the budget process and figure out, based on what we're seeing in sales and use, what we're seeing in rooms, and the number of towns that are implementing a lot, there was an attempt to figure out what the appropriation should be. And between fiscal year 17 and 21, those were pretty closely aligned. And then, as mentioned by VLCT, post-pandemic consumption tax revenues really started to increase, and you started to see revenues outpace kind of these estimates of where local option tax revenue, the estimates where they thought it would be. And so you started to see larger surpluses in each fiscal year. By fiscal year 24, this additional revenue allowed pilot payments to be fully funded. So you can see between 2017 and 2024, there was a huge increase in the amount or decrease in the proration, but essentially towns were able to get way closer to, we're able to get to fully funded from a proration percent of 74.7 in fiscal year 27. In fiscal year 24, the difference between revenue and expenses was not quite $3.3 billion. And so, yeah, there are two drivers, as mentioned earlier. There were pandemic era changes in spending habits. There's increased spending on goods, particularly online. I shared this, I think, in my consumption tax 101. You can really see that there was post-pandemic, folks looked around at the stuff in their house and decided to do an upgrade. And so, you know,
Also, people had a lot of extra cash.
Exactly.
The federal government had sent checks to all of us.
exactly, yes. And so, yes, there was a lot more disposable income. And so you could really see, you know, there's a long-term trend in the economy towards more spending occurring on services, and that slightly reversed post-pandemic. On the meals and room side, there was a lot of, particularly in Vermont, post-pandemic travel, folks feeling cooped up. And so after the pandemic, decided to take vacation. So yes, both of those drivers helped really spur consumption tax revenue increases. The other piece is an increase in the number of municipalities with a local option tax. And so in 2017, you had 17 municipalities with a meals and rooms tax, 14 with the sales tax. And then by 2024, that had increased to 28 and 22. So a pretty substantial increase there.
Well, I'm just curious, and this may be beyond the presentation, but the trend looks like a tapering in terms of the rate of growth is slowing. And is that a correct characterization of this?
On the first piece or the second?
The first.
The first piece, yes.
Yeah.
We're absolutely, yes. The increase, I think, oh gosh, I would have to look, but you're seeing, you know, in fiscal year 23 actuals, an increase of 7.1% in sales and use tax. And then fiscal year 20 to 24, it was only a 1.9% increase. You start getting into some current law, some changes to the base of the sales tax, right, with the expansion to pre-written software access remotely. But yes, you're seeing far less, even with that base expansion, a far less increase in percentage.
Sorry, and at what point will we have any indication? I mean, we're starting to hear nationally that these numbers are softening quite significantly. At what point will we see that in the Vermont data?
Yes,
Just assume it's gonna happen because we're seeing it federally.
Yes, I think it's a great question. It will certainly, the place you would see it first is the July update to the consensus revenue forecast. Tom Cavett and Jeff Card, the economists, will certainly, they're spending a lot of time looking into that data to make sure there isn't an anticipated softening or softening that's occurring.
Are you able to differentiate between the increase in revenues sort of across the board and the increase in revenues related to the number of new LOTs?
I could do, it would be a little bit of work, absolutely, but yes, I think broadly speaking, when you have a new local option tax, that's a bit stronger of a driver of revenue than increases in consumption tax, very broadly speaking. But yes, I could do more work to isolate.
It's mostly just that if we're going to change the percentage, I don't want to change the percentage too far so that we wind up not fully funding pilots after the one single year we've ever done it, right? Like that would be absurd, and there's a real risk of that. And I don't want to be so conservative that we're hoarding money like dragons.
Well, that is a good segue into the next slide. Thank you.
Dragons are always a good segue.
Yep. When in doubt. So yes, the 30% allocation of lot revenue, there were a few different iterations of the share between municipalities and the pilot special fund. The current 30% allocation started in 2006. If you were to say, okay, there's a bit of a surplus with our 30% allocation to the pilot special fund, what would be a percentage that more closely aligns with expenses in the fund? Looking at data from fiscal year 24, which is a bit of a conservative number because there may be more local option tax towns, but still we'd like to be conservative. If you allocated 25% of lot revenue, it would be $12.06 million in local option tax revenue. These numbers, if you're trying to do some mental math, don't perfectly correlate because you have to account for return fees. But 25% of local option tax revenue is $12 million roughly. And then in fiscal year 24, the expenses in the special fund were 11.63 million. So any further increase in the municipal percentage would probably get you into that. You get into a deficit.
Any further than 25?
Yes.
But the return fee is like $5.96, whatever it is, per return that's filed. Okay,
Yes.
it's not significant.
It adds up. It's over $2 million in fiscal year 24 because the return is each retailer, right, sending over,
Oh,
right, you're
thank you. I misunderstood. I thought
per
it was
month, depending on how they file and
the
yes.
filer, not per town. Thank
That's
you.
what I thought. Is that?
Yeah.
And how much was the total a year?
I will follow up in an email to get the exact number. I know the first number is a 2, but I'll provide the point something.
That makes
This-
a lot more sense. I just thought, what is it, 598?
Okay, so, going back to Representative, Kimball's point, we were to change things on the other end. So that some of these towns like Johnson would get more of a pilot. We'd have to be careful what we do with this, percentage, correct?
Exactly. Yes, this is modeling based on the current law structure and current law calculation.
Okay,
Yep.
And recognizing that we can absolutely amend anything any way we want, anytime. That was not the proposal that either the league or the governor's budget has put forward to us.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think changing that might would be a sort of a significant dive into something. So I want to make sure we have time for that, if that's what the plan is. Or the interest of the committee.
And then to add a little more context, had some conversations with Vermont Emergency Management about the buyout, or they refer to them as acquisition projects at Vermont Emergency Management. But section E142.2 of the governor's recommended budget, right, proposes this program that would provide pilot funds to make municipalities whole on the piece of property tax that they would be losing for properties that do participate in these programs. Vermont Emergency Management indicated that there are 227 properties that are on applications that they have. Do want to note that there are certainly properties that aren't on these applications that with property tax support, towns may decide to move forward with them. The properties are primarily residential, over 90% of them. Many are situated in central Vermont, in Plainfield, Hardwick, Barry, Corinth. Linden is another big source of properties on these applications. And there's a $1 million appropriation to fund the program. Did some initial preliminary look at the forecasted property tax revenue, and it's about 550,000, depending on, this is assuming kind of all residential properties. You have to, to take from the PBR annual report an average residential value and apply municipal tax rates, but that's assuming that, all 227 properties go through. Talking with Vermont Emergency Management, the program's voluntary, and so some of those may fall through. But that's an initial fiscal look at kind of that piece.
When you say that towns may be able to support additional applications with property tax support, and say that if they get this million, they may locally be able to extend the number from 227 to something else?
So some of and folks who are closer to these communities can certainly speak to it better than I can, but I've certainly heard that the concern, if you allow these properties to move through with buyouts, the loss in property tax revenue is really what's keeping these towns from doing so. And so if you have a program like this, which makes municipalities whole, they may open up further properties to a buyout type program, and that would increase the number from 227. Yes, and the appropriation is there. It is spending authority, so it would depend on the number of properties that are certified by the Division of Public Safety language.
Right, I was gonna clarify, they would have to be FEMA approved buyouts, and there are certain regulations that go with that. There may be communities that would want to do a buyout totally separately because they don't want to follow the same rules that FEMA might have required of them. So there might be a local effort to do that.
And per the 227 number, again, that's the number that has been sent to VEM, not approved by FEMA. And it's an imperfect number, but generally there's less than 100. There are less than 100 properties that the towns denied buyouts to. In other words, folks who sought buyouts, but the town did not send it to VEM there. So even if all of those people did, it wouldn't be a significantly larger number. Even if all the folks who were seeking buyouts who were denied opted in because of this, it wouldn't be, it's not like there's another 227. There would be a
Yeah, just
low
get
number.
some.
And folks, just for like a flight plan context here, this is sort of doing all of this work in the context of the budget doesn't make very much sense to me. And we are planning, there's a flood related bill that's in the Government Operations Committee that's going to come to us if and when they vote it out, and was hoping to do this work, whatever it winds up looking like, in the context of that bill when it gets to us.
Just to understand the money piece, talked about it briefly yesterday, but it's $550,000 what you calculated using all that math. Could be higher, could be lower, but 550 is an annual expense.
Annual, yes, and this is to be 100% clear, this is a preliminary estimate, so yes, just kind of taking a first look at it, but yes, that would be an annual.
So if that was the amount, and the program is 5 years, and I guess we'll get into the greater detail of that, 5 years would be $7.5 million. Well, no, way off. $500,000, $2.5 million.
What would it be over 5 years?
So this is also assuming that there are no future disasters.
Yeah.
This is at the current level of buyouts, but yes, you would 550 times 5. Yes, 2.5 million plus some extra ones. I'm not great at, JFO like saying we don't do math in public, so.
Yeah.
Yes, and then let's continue through the presentation.
Oh,
Oh, great.
have
Looking
you,
ahead.
VLCT said that the $1 million would be adequate to fund the program. I don't know whether they meant for 1 year or for no, I think they said full 5 years in the presentation we just got. And that's also how it was. This thing could cost, we all know this could cost $5 million. I'm all for it.
All right.
Have you talked to Doug? Because Doug Farnham also, Doug Farnham also presented it that the $1 million would be good for 5 years. So have you checked? I mean, if there's two different sets of math being used, I just want to clarify that before we go further down this road.
I have it in my notebook here to follow up with tax, because yes, in the presentation before, there was an indication that they spoke with tax and there was that would fund it for 5 years. And so there may be, yes, so confirming our methodologies and getting on the same page. Yep.
And for just sort of committee information, if there's a difference, if there's not a consensus forecast on any number, we make decisions based on Joint Fiscal Office's numbers always.
Yep.
Okay. Any further questions? Yeah.
Maybe, again, a question for GovOps or, since I was on GovOps, but is there any qualifications for the local option tax to be used by the town in a certain period of time? Or can they, I'm just thinking about Montgomery in particular.
There are no, so the local, there have been conversations over the years, mostly deeply encouraged by the previous chair of this committee, that local option taxes would go into some sort of dedicated something at the municipal level, but that is not part of statute in any way. Many communities do that in order to get it passed, and some do it just verbally, and some do it in a special fund, but there's nothing in the statute about that at all.
Okay, because that's what I remember the discussion around.
There's a vibe towards it, but no statute on it.
And I'm just using Montgomery as an example now where their plans kind of fell apart in regards to what they're thinking of doing, and it's pretty obvious they're gonna have to redirect somehow, so we got the money, some of the money. Okay, thanks.
Thanks,
Sure,
appreciate it.
of course.
Folks, we're gonna take a 5-minute break.